Hello, my lovely rose garden! As you may recall from my All About Alice video, this year I want to make videos that help explain what each of my books is about in order to be more informative to members of my YouTube audience who haven't heard much about them. So last time I talked about my first novel, Alice. In this video, it's Like Falling Stars' turn. Like Falling Stars began in its earliest version as a roleplay between a group of friends that I kind of just barged into, where each of the characters was a fairy that represented a season. I just kind of threw a very haphazard character into the mix who was solely there to interact with these other characters, and then decided that I liked the aesthetic so much I'd ask them if I could turn it into a book. I don't think this was the right way to go about this at all. The roleplay ended up not really going anywhere since these characters were just one-off ideas with no end goal in mind. Most of the roleplayers left them behind to do other things, and if I'm being honest, I'm surprised it even managed to get as far as it did before imploding on itself like this. There's a lesson here, folks. If you're going to collaborate with other creatives on a project, maybe work with people you know instead of inserting yourself into someone else's roleplay and trying to monetize it. I have no idea how I thought this was going to work, especially since it turned out that like at least 2 of the roleplayers were minors and probably couldn't legally agree to me using their characters in a published work anyway. But this was all back in the early 2010s before I really shaped up about business and published the current edition of Alice, so I suppose we'll cut college freshman me some slack since I clearly didn't know what the hell I was doing. That all went downhill in a hurry due to creative differences, ended with one of the roleplayers withdrawing their character from the project, and then I realized this was a bad idea from the start and scrapped pretty much everything I'd written up to that point to avoid plagiarizing anything from the original roleplay. About 1.5 years of writing progress was almost entirely unusable. As my illustrator, Ray had been working with me on this project for a little while, and together we brainstormed new character concepts and story ideas that would work better as a cohesive slice-of-life fantasy narrative, which turned out to be for the best in the long run, and got a solid backstory and motivation for one thing. I then asked Ray to redesign the 4 seasonal fairy characters completely, as the original designs belonged to other people no longer associated with the project. And with absolutely no offense to the original designs, I think he knocked the new ones right out of the park. And adding on to the idea that you should probably only collaborate with people you know well, he and one of our other longtime friends, Artie, contributed a few minor characters to the cast roster. Cecil and Tanya belong to Ray, and Oberon is based on a character belonging to Artie that she agreed to let us use, and they're credited for creating the characters in the legal page of the final manuscript. So after basically tossing 1.5 years of work in the trash and starting over, what did we come up with? Let's start with the blurb. Once upon a time, there was an amnesiac and a fairy prince. All Anne wanted was to go home. All Nicholas wanted was to be left alone. However, when Anne woke up in the woods with no memory of her past, fate brought them together, and friendship soon bound them to each other. Facing their uncertainties about the future side by side, their desires become less clear. There's no guarantee that Anne will like the person she used to be, and Nicholas may never see her again if he lets her go. Even in fairy tales, happy endings are not easy to come by. Anne and Nicholas will have to decide how much their friendship is worth if they want a true happily ever after. In hindsight, this blurb says more about the characters than the plot, but that's kind of fitting because Like Falling Stars is a character-focused slice-of-life fantasy. I think you could argue that it doesn't follow a traditional 3-act structure. The characters encounter a problem, address that problem, and then move on to a different problem. While Nicholas and Anne do have overarching problems that aren't resolved until the end, I definitely wrote the conflicts in this book to be almost entirely internal, with the perception of external conflicts, but the stakes are very low here. If Anne doesn't get her memory back, nothing terrible will happen. The world isn't resting on anyone's shoulders, there's no villain. It's just these characters living their lives, interacting, and developing their relationships with each other. So to describe the plot conflicts without going into spoilers, as stated in the blurb, Anne has amnesia. She woke up in the woods and doesn't know how she got there or where she came from. While wandering, she bumps into a woman named Tanya, who points her in the direction of a frost fairy, Nicholas, who has been causing some problems with the other fairies. He's very hostile toward them and incorrectly perceives most social interactions with his peers as a threat or an attack on him. Due to the fairies' law of hospitality, Nicholas has no choice but to allow Anne to stay with him for 1 week, at which point he can turn her loose into the dangerous enchanted forest again. But he gets attached. Anne is one of the only people he's ever met who he isn't threatened by and actually relates to. Against his better judgment, and another one of the fairies' laws, he decides to allow her to stay beyond the 1-week time limit and now has to figure out how he's going to keep her secret from the other fairies who, for some reason, won't leave him alone. Meanwhile, Anne continues to look around for clues to her identity and gradually uncovers the secrets of a witch who cursed the nearby town 100 years ago. It's a cozy fantasy with lots of allusions and nods to fairy tales and fairy tale tropes. When I was writing it, I pictured it as the kind of book I'd like to read when the weather starts to get cold and rainy, and all I want to do is cuddle up under a warm blanket with a hot cup of tea or cocoa. One of the other driving factors of the story for me was my frustration with the compulsory romance I see in most media that features both a male and female lead, particularly Oz the Great and Powerful. I decided right from the start that Anne and Nicholas would not end up together by the end of the book. This story is about their friendship and how they help each other figure out who they want to be. And then, of course, they ended up having a ton of romantic chemistry, and they're one of my favorite couples. They're like right up there with Erica and Bolton from Stellar Eclipse. But they do not get together in Like Falling Stars or even in the planned sequel that I'm currently working on. These stories are still about friendship first. In my mind, it would take Nicholas so long to realize that he has romantic feelings for Anne, and then he wouldn't really know what to do about it. Slow burn idiots to lovers at its finest. I'm starting to talk more about the characters already because it's pretty much impossible to describe the plot of Like Falling Stars in any detail without focusing on the characters, so let's just talk about them now. Anne. Anne is baby and gremlin. I love her so much. She was the character that I played, and I actually continued role-playing with her for a while with some other people, but her book counterpart ended up being very different from her roleplay version. In Like Falling Stars, Anne is fairly naive, but she's also super eager to learn new things and does so quickly, at least when it comes to reading books and exploring the woods during the day when it's safe. Because she has amnesia and doesn't remember basically anything about her past other than her name, she lacks social graces and tends to just say whatever she's thinking. She's got her heart on her sleeve and doesn't do anything by halves. At the same time, she has a lot of anxiety about the fact that she has no memories and doesn't know what kind of person she used to be. She's naive, not oblivious. She takes notice of the fact that no one seems to be looking for her and concludes that she might have been an awful person with no friends, and that's very upsetting to her. Her character arc mainly revolves around figuring out who she wants to be and reconciling what she does learn about her past with that idea. The other lead character is Nicholas, who is Prince of the Frost Fairies, which is a job, not a royal position, but king of social anxiety. I did actually write him to be on the autism spectrum, which contributes to his social anxiety because he has a hard time reading tone and facial expressions, which leads to him projecting his poor self-esteem and assuming people are mocking him when they aren't. However, since the word autism is never used to describe him, and trust me, I am looking for ways to work it into New Constellations, the sequel novella, I could totally understand people missing that and just reading him as a character with social anxiety, which is his main issue anyway. Being autistic as well just kind of makes it a little harder in some situations. At the beginning of the story, Nicholas has totally given in to his anxiety. He assumes the worst of everyone, lashes out preemptively to protect himself from threats that aren't really there, and locks himself away from the world in his castle. Once he's able to actually relate to Anne, he starts looking at things a little differently, but he still has a long way to go in repairing the relationships his past actions damaged and learning to be a good friend. So his arc mainly centered on realizing when he was in the wrong and beginning to take actions to make things right. which is a struggle, especially with a condition like social anxiety. The supporting cast is also full of great characters that I love so much. The other seasonal fairies are Jack, Drew, and Julius, who rule summer, spring, and autumn respectively. Sadly, Drew gets the least amount of page time because most of the story is set in autumn when he's at his weakest and is resting to conserve his magic, but he'll show up more in New Constellations. He's the mom friend of the group and is just so tired of the shenanigans. Wine mom, for sure. Julius is kind of a little stinker, but he has reason. He and Nicholas have a very antagonistic relationship and get on each other's nerves a lot. Nicholas treats Julius pretty badly, and Julius responds in kind, and it's just kind of gotten worse and worse over the years with seemingly no end in sight. I absolutely adore Julius's design. He is a small boy with gigantic wings that are too big for his body, so they end up like trailing on the ground. It's super cute. Lastly, for the season fairies, we have Jack, who is best boy I stan. Jack is new to the Northern Realm, aka Europe, and is just transferred from the Oceanic Realm, aka Australia. So he's kind of coming into all this drama already in progress, unprepared, and all he really wants is to get along with everyone and be friends. He's really not sure how to go about it though, since Nicholas has kind of made everything tense. Jack is an absolute sweetheart sunshine man, and I love him. Aside from those three, there's also Cecil and Tanya, who, as I mentioned earlier, belong to Ray. Anne meets Tanya first when she's in the forest, and Tanya is a very mysterious but kind woman who offers sage advice and seems to understand the ways of the woods. At least she's not intimidated by being alone in them at night, which Anne is told multiple times is really dangerous since they are enchanted and full of fairies, not all of which take kindly to people. Cecil is the librarian of the local all but abandoned town that 100 years prior burned a witch that cursed the town. Cecil helps Anne out when he can and is one of her first dependable friends. They like to meet up every now and again and talk about books. As you can probably tell, the main themes and ideas I had in mind for this book are identity, self-perception, and how interpersonal relationships help us define ourselves. Both Anne and Nicholas have to deal with how they view themselves and decide who they want to be. While the main focus is definitely on their friendship and how it impacts each of their journeys, they also learn and develop their identities through their relationships with other characters too. I definitely plan on continuing this idea in New Constellations. And I think that's about it for Like Falling Stars, so I just want to wrap this up by saying that yes, there is a sequel coming, New Constellations. It was originally going to be a comic, but we decided to shift it to being a novella so Ray could get started working on Alice's comic sequel, Joker. New Constellations is an immediate follow-up to Like Falling Stars that covers the next year of Anne's life, starting in spring and ending in winter, as she continues figuring out her life and what she wants to do with it. It definitely has the same low-stakes, cozy slice-of-life vibe with her developing her friendships with some of the more minor characters in Like Falling Stars. Nicholas is still there, but he's not as much of a main focus as he was in Like Falling Stars. And that's everything! Do you have more questions about Like Falling Stars? Who's your favorite character out of the ones described? Let me know in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more like it, and check out the links in the description to the book trailers, the audio adaptation of one of the early scenes in Like Falling Stars, and my bookstore where you can buy it in ebook and paperback. Be sure to check out the links to my Patreon and social media accounts for even more content. Keep reading till next time, Rose Garden.